beneficiaries, two attitudes towards the Silk Road. The first one is, they're bad actors, they're agitators, they bring the ire of regulators upon us all.
No.
And if it weren't for them, we'd be able to charm the beneficiaries of proof of violence into standing idly by while we dismantle proof of violence systems. I think there may be some logical issues with this perspective, but I'll allow you to decide. Now, the second attitude, which is also fairly common, is, well, the Silk Road is a boon for peace in the trade of prohibited items like guns, drugs, etc.
Raw milk, dangerous stuff.
And raw milk. Now, I think number two makes a lot of sense. So this was supported by a criminology paper that was released recently. And if you think about it intuitively, it kind of makes sense because the prohibition of certain items creates work for enforcers, and it creates opportunities for, shall we say, extra-legal cartels who use violence to maintain their cartel status.
They're
Extra-legal.
extra legal.
And if you put the stuff on the internet, well, you can't shoot someone over the internet, and so it's a bit safer for everyone that's involved. Some of us are in a bit of a state of denial over where the violence in these trades is coming from, right? Because we talk a lot about the violence that's involved with drug sellers, drug buyers. We don't talk too much about the law enforcement piece of things, right? So even if you work for law enforcement, you also can't shoot someone over the internet, and that's potentially a kind of safety that's afforded to the market participants. Which side of the Silk Road is the most violent? Which poses the most threat to human life? Well, in 2011, nearly half of the US prison population, which is the largest prison population in the world per capita, was incarcerated. What's that?
In history.
In history, sure. Nearly half of those people were incarcerated for drug-related crimes. And by the political prisoners. And by the end of 2012, we had 100,000 people in federal prisons for drug-related crimes, even more than that in state prisons, and approximately 280,000 human beings on parole for drug-related offenses as well. Let's compare the headlines. What was the headline about the Dread Pirate Roberts? Man allegedly hires fictional hitman to kill fictional mass blackmailer. Because this is essentially what the charges boil down to. Some guy that he never met said, I'm going to dox everyone on the Silk Road, and you know exactly what's going to happen if I release this information. You know what's going to happen to those market participants. On the other hand, if you look at the war on drugs, what are the headlines? SWAT team burns infant with flashbang grenade in no-knock raid. So over here on the right, this is John Lennon, and he invited us to imagine a different kind of world with his lovely song. And what I'm imagining is that I think that the Silk Road and marketplaces like this are a proof of concept for censorship-resistant marketplaces. If people are able to exchange some of the most highly prohibited items all around the world successfully for long periods of time, surely other forms of trade are also all possible on these platforms. In other words, the question that I'm posing to you is, what if we could take the reductions in state violence that we're seeing on the Silk Road and extend it into other markets as well? Now, clearly, the technology associated with dark marketplaces is rapidly improving, but the question is, will society allow it to continue? Will they embrace it? Will it stay exactly the same as it is right now? Or will it be merely relegated to history? In order to understand society's relationship to the Silk Road and to these dark marketplaces, I want to look at a moral precedent in US history. So in 1860 in the United States, there was around 3.9 million black slaves, and 1.8 million of those were sent to the fields to pick cotton. And as large as the banking industry is today in the United States, at that time it wasn't the largest industry. Actually, all of the money that they invested in banks was only a third of the size of the total market value of slaves in the United States. So slaves were very, very important to white people. And all around the world, cotton was king during this period of time. It was an important industry all over the world, and it was the leading export for the United States in 1803 through 1937. Now, New York City, which of course is a city near and dear to our hearts for us that are in the Bitcoin scene, was not always a center of commerce. What made it a center of commerce was the cotton trade and slavery. And uncomfortably enough at the time, and this created a good deal of racial tension, it was also the largest population of non-black slaves in the entire United States. So the city was built on slavery, and yet many of the freed slaves had escaped to New York City. I think this is an important historical precedent because, of course, if you look back into history, there's no dark marketplace, there's no encrypted marketplace in history to look at to see what's going to happen with the Silk Road, but as Mark Twain has said, history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So most of the population at this time still supported slavery. They considered it to be a critical industry related to the cotton trade. To them, it was too big to fail, too big to change. And they were concerned that if we just let all these slaves go, who would pick the cotton? Today we understand that this is a tremendously immoral question, right? The answer is it doesn't matter who picks the cotton. All that matters are the moral principles. You follow the moral principles and the market works out the rest for us. Now, despite the fact that most people supported slavery, there was a minority of the population. We can think of them as early adopters of morality who did oppose slavery. They were the abolitionists, and they wanted to abolish slavery. Many of these abolitionists possessed a kind of amazing moral clarity about slavery, even though it was so unpopular at the time. In New York City, the abolitionists referred to slave catchers as kidnappers, which is exactly how we understand them today. They were people that were paid to find other people and kidnap them. What was the state doing at this time? Well, it was doing what it usually does, right? It legalized slavery in many states. It subsidized slavery. And the moral conscience of abolitionists be damned, there was a fugitive slave law that allowed slave catchers to conscript normal citizens into the act of kidnapping slaves. And if they did not go along with this, or if they even resisted, they could be fined up to $500, worth approximately $13,000 today or more, or they could be imprisoned themselves. And judges were implicated in this too. In fact, if they gave a decision concerning the status of a runaway slave that found in favor of the slave being sent back down south, they'd be giving $10 by the slave catchers for that. They'd be paid. If they give a negative decision, they would be paid $5, the de facto bribe. And I think we can imagine that if they're going to get paid for a positive decision, if the vast majority of society supports them in this, then it's going to be very easy for them to make that decision. In fact, this was such a problem that in fact many free black people were not slaves. People who were not born into slavery, people who had bought their way out of slavery through legitimate legalized means, were actually captured and sent down south. It's very difficult to prove that you're not a slave because the best you could really do is have a piece of paper, a certificate of freedom. But that piece of paper could be confiscated, it could be destroyed. And these people had no right to a jury or anything like that. They would just go before the magistrate and the slave catcher, or perhaps the police officer. And many of these people were kidnapped and literally sold down the river before their families even knew that they had gone missing. Some abolitionists were not content to wait for political reform, and they took matters into their own hands. And they formed an organization, which is quite famous now, called the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was essentially a network of people. This was a decentralized network. There was no single point of failure. There was no leader of the Underground Railroad. It was a fault-tolerant network in that the people who operated safe houses along the the Underground Railroad, they operated as cells. They didn't know about all the other cells in their area. So if you shut one down, you wouldn't necessarily shut the rest down. And an interesting fact, the Underground Railroad also used steganography, which is an area of cryptography, in order to communicate with slaves. And they did this through songs. Because how would slaves that lived their entire lives on a plantation have any idea to figure out how to find the Underground Railroad? Well, the most famous song in this category was Follow the Drinking Gourd, which to a slave owner probably sounded like some kind of spiritual nonsense, a fun little song. But to slaves, what it told them was escape the plantation, travel in the dead of night, and follow the Big Dipper constellation, the drinking gourd, up north towards the Underground Railroad. Now, I think that the way that we perceive language and how it shifts over time is very important to consider in understanding society's moral relationship with these things. So the Underground Railroad was neither underground nor was it a railroad. It was underground in the sense that it was a network of people who operated in secret, ferrying slaves up north to safety. And the further north you went, the safer you were. At the time, since people were very much in favor of slavery and considered these slaves to be property, they probably considered the word underground to mean something very negative. It probably meant to them something seedy, something subversive, law-breaking, and even associated with theft. Now today, we have a very different understanding of the word underground and the Underground Railroad. If you look at this woman here over the right, she's got a Harriet Tubman shirt on that says, "The original ride or die chick." She was a famous former slave who operated in the Underground Railroad. And so now the underground and the Underground Railroad to us means something morally courageous, something hip, something cool, something very clever. It means to resist illegitimate authority. And I think there is the potential for the language that we use to talk about things like the Silk Road, these dark marketplaces, for our perceptions of that language to shift over time as well. I think we will come to understand the word dark in a different way as we have to come to understand the word underground in a different way. Now, the Silk Road is a dark marketplace, and a dark marketplace is simply a place on the internet where people use cryptography to hide as much information about their transactions as possible. And they do this by adopting pseudonyms, they use anonymity networks like Tor, they use cryptocurrencies, of course. They're very careful about how they package their mail so they can blend in with the rest of the mail. They're very careful about how they receive mail. To most of the general population, their associations with dark, as it applies to the internet, it's kind of a negative association right now. It means something dangerous, something counterproductive and untrustworthy. In fact, the first online space to call themselves dark market was a forum somewhere out there on the recess of the internet, it's since been shut down, where they exchanged stolen credit card information, which is obviously a strictly immoral kind of operation. When we talk about markets in general, we are now working with some kind of confusing language because we tend to think of markets in terms of black markets and white markets and gray markets. And the problem with these terms is that they are culturally relative. They are defined by local laws. Something that would be sold on the black market in one place in the world might be perfectly white market to sell another place in the world. And yet, what's confusing about these terms is that they carry the weight of moral language. I think a better way to discuss markets is in terms of moral markets and immoral markets. In other words, is this marketplace, is it predominated by peaceful, voluntary interaction, or is it predominantly theft and fraud? I think the term black market doesn't fit very well for the Silk Road because it seems that although some of the market activity there is immoral, involving theft or fraud, the majority of that activity is the voluntary exchange of goods and services. But perhaps they're trending somewhere darker, somewhere more devious. Well, let's look at the trends. I would submit that these marketplaces are actually evolving towards more voluntary market interaction. They have things like escrow, arbitration, and reputation to help weed out, pun intended, fraud and theft by buyers and sellers. And a more recent development is that many of these marketplaces have implemented multi-signature escrow to prevent theft by outside parties. Essentially, this just means if someone hacks into the server that stores these marketplaces, they do not have the necessary private key material in order to steal funds, and so the escrow funds. And so buyers and sellers are safe from this kind of attack. So I think that this actually exemplifies virtuous market behavior, and I submit that these dark marketplaces on the whole are in fact moral markets.
And that's the same tech we use for the nukes, right? The different two keys at the same time, so it's pretty secure.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, we hope so. So what about this word dark in dark market? What defines the darkness? Darkness is the absence of light. And I would say that light in the marketplace is defined by voluntary interactions. You want to buy something, I want to sell it to you. Good, that's perfectly appropriate behavior in a marketplace. The state, on the other hand, is defined by restrictions on voluntary market activity. As Barack Obama himself said, government is a monopoly on the initiation of force. So the darkness in dark markets is not the opposite of lightness. It's not involuntary interaction. It's actually the shadow cast by the state that obstructs the light in the marketplace. Dark marketplaces assume their characteristics based on the shadow that is cast upon them. And primarily what they are trying to achieve is they are trying to extend censorship resistance from information to economics. For a long time now, we've had some technologies to help us in the realm of censorship-resistant information. We have the internet, we have Twitter, we have Tor, things like that, and we're simply trying to extend this into the marketplace now. I think that humanity's goal should always be to move towards the prevalence of voluntary interactions. This is the essence of abolitionism. And therefore, I would say that people who today oppose capital controls are neo-abolitionists. So the dark markets are a model for people to evade the economic censorship of the state. And what they're going to do for us is they're going to provide a transition economy to get us from where we are today to where we want to be, to a truly free market economy. If a system wants to be censorship resistant, it has to have at least two very important qualities, and they can be adopted in either order. We've seen either order happen. The first one is that you must decentralize the locus of control. If your organization has a headquarters, a CEO, if it has a bank account, then men with guns can show up, they can shut it down, or they can co-opt it. And the second thing that you must do for these systems is you must protect the participants. You can do this with anonymity networks like Tor. You could do it with mutual aid legal services. There are lots of things that you can do. Now the Silk Road, they accomplished number two first. They made it a Tor hidden site. And so all the people that would sign on, they were necessarily using Tor to protect their identity. And now we're seeing that these dark marketplaces are moving on to accomplish the first quality that you require, which is to decentralize the locus of control in projects like Dark Market and Open Bazaar. Open Bazaar, Brian Hoffman talked about yesterday so eloquently. Bitcoin, on the other hand, accomplished number one first with the blockchain by having a global mining population that's minting new coins and verifying transactions. And number two is still a work in progress because Bitcoin privacy still kind of sucks. So what if we could extend dark markets into new areas? As I said before, surely if you can trade guns and drugs, you could trade something more pedestrian, perhaps a washing machine. And someone might say, well, look, guns and drugs are small. You can kind of package them up very easily and cheaply in the mail. washing machine is heavy, so you can't do that. But I actually think that transportation systems are going to become increasingly market agnostic. They're not really going to care whether the washing machine came from an open bazaar transaction or Amazon.com. And we may eventually see transportation systems joining the dark market. So, if dark markets can have those two critical qualities of censorship resistance, what they can do for other industries that are not explicitly prohibited is they can circumvent capital controls. And there are at least two important elements of that. One is tax avoidance. Taxes make everything extremely expensive because they are multi-tiered. So for example, let's say you run a company that has a factory. You purchase widgets from 3 different companies, you put them together, assemble them, and then you sell them to customers. Well, all of your suppliers have all manner of taxes. There'll be taxes getting those widgets to you transported. There may be sales taxes that you have to pay in order to purchase the widgets. It will arrive at your factory where you will be subject to all manner of property taxes. And it will be assembled by your workforce, where there is an incredible number of taxes: payroll taxes, social security taxes, healthcare taxes. And then you will have to transport to the customers another tax, and then a sales tax to get it to the actual customers. So that makes things extremely expensive. The other thing that censorship-resistant markets can get us is to go beyond trade barriers. And trade barriers are simply restrictions on what goods we can sell, to whom, how we can send them, where we can send them, etc. So what I'm anticipating is in addition to a technological singularity, we will also see a kind of private property singularity, where technology allows us to circumvent state regulations. And as this happens, economic growth is going to get faster and faster and faster. It's going to accelerate until the point where it will be very difficult to predict what the marketplace will look like a year from now, and then a month from now, and then a week from now. As with Bitcoin, industries will start out by just dipping their toe into these dark marketplaces. What happens if we sell maybe one item here on the down low? Maybe it falls off the back of the truck. But they'll do it more surreptitiously than with Bitcoin, right? Because it's a little bit trickier and more risky to sell something through, say, Open Bazaar than it is to simply start accepting Bitcoin for your business, right? Circumvention of capital controls is the killer feature of dark marketplaces that is going to drive more and more industries into the dark markets in the future. I don't mean that all of the companies that currently exist are going to be trading over Open Bazaar necessarily. Maybe Amazon never wishes to do that. Maybe Overstock never wishes to do that. I don't know. But I think that more and more of the industry will go into these dark marketplaces and eventually replace some of these old kind of companies. So to put this in perspective, I wanted to pose kind of a scenario to you. What does the world look like when we extend freedom to more market interaction? Well, consider a young child that's born in Africa, impoverished. Perhaps his parents are illiterate, very limited economic opportunity where he happened to be born in the world. And perhaps he gets air-dropped one of these one laptop per child devices. They actually tried this out in Ethiopia. They took a bunch of these devices, computers, they airdropped them to Ethiopia, no instructions whatsoever, and they just waited and saw what happened. And what they found was that these young people, who you would not expect to be able to do much of anything with the computers, within 5 months they had managed to hack the devices, reverse engineer them, and remove the controls that they put, the restrictions they had put on the devices. Young minds, when they are given the tools, some very simple tools, can accomplish incredible things. Another thing that's on the horizon, cryptocurrency-powered mesh networks. Mesh networks are peer-to-peer networks, where rather than everyone having their own internet service provider connection to the internet individually, instead we are connected in a peer-to-peer fashion, perhaps wirelessly, perhaps satellite, whatever it is. And this way, if we only need to send packet information through the internet to someone that's around us we go through our peer-to-peer network. If we have to go out to the rest of the internet, then we share the connections of other people. What Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies give us is a price discovery mechanism that is going to cause an explosion of participation in these mesh networks. They haven't been scalable up until this point because there's not much incentive for you to contribute bandwidth to these mesh networks. But if your computer is getting paid to do so, then it's going to be very happy to do so as well. So suppose this young man, he's got his computer, he's learning how to code, he's learning how to do graphic design, he's connected to the internet now. He goes onto one of these dark marketplaces like Open Bazaar, registers there, and suddenly he's able to do business with, let's say, a startup company in Mexico, doing coding work and graphic design work for them. Very competitive in the market, extremely low cost of living where he lives, and yet he's still able to make 20 to 30 times more than he could ever make having a local job. And the way that I see this is, you know the string and cup thing, where you to connect two cups with a string? What this forms is a cup and string network from person to person, a million times over, all over the globe. And exploding out each end of the cup is economic opportunity where it did not previously exist. The world 10, 20 years from now, because of these mechanisms, is going to be so unrecognizable to us that it's going to blow our minds. And it's partly to do with technology, but it has a lot to do with economic liberation as well. Now, the local politicians in this young man's African village are not going to like this at all. They want to be seen as the economic progenitors of progress. And some of them actually just want to keep people poor, because what happens is the Western world sends all this foreign aid to them, and the people that rule there, they simply confiscate the funds, they intercept them, and they spend it on themselves, their friends, their family, their business interests, and very little of that money actually trickles down to the people that are trying to be helped. So when economic opportunity happens, that flow of funds for them to intercept is going to be cut off, and they're going to get very mad. And yet, they will be all but powerless to stop this. Because this technology gives us anonymous exchange on marketplaces, and it also gives us anonymous money. Perhaps this young man is using something like dark wallet, the upside down pyramid with the eyeball. And the people who want him to not have access to this technology and information and opportunity will be all but powerless to identify and locate this young man.
An upside down pyramid with an eyeball, what's that mean?
That's the dark wallet logo.
But what's it mean?
I think it means, it's like the all-seeing eye, but it's flipped around.
Yep, that's awesome.
Cody Wilson. So, this is the story of the Silk Road to me. It is not a story about troublemakers going on the internet, buying and selling drugs and creating chaos for other people. It's not that at all. It is not merely a revolution in the peaceful trade of drugs online. It is a blueprint for economic global liberation. And this is a blueprint that I believe we do not need to fear, that we should in fact celebrate and embrace. And I hope that you will join me in doing so. Thank you.